Colonel AQ, Colonel O'Neill Bogle, Major Damian Friend, Chaplain, other senior officers, warrant officers, senior and junior NCOs, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning. The Chaplaincy and Welfare Department has as its mandate to support command. We do this by providing the tools necessary to nurture spiritual, emotional, and social well-being of each soldier so that they are fit to fight, fit for life, and fit for their family. We endeavor to accomplish this through our regular Padre Hour sessions, with each formation, as well as conducting lectures and discussion sessions that deal with personal and professional development, as well as mental health support. World Mental Health Day, sponsored by the World Health Organization, the WHO, is observed on October 10th every year. The overall objective of World Mental Health Day is to raise awareness of mental health issues around the world and to mobilize efforts in support of mental health. The Jamaica Defense Force, through collaboration with the Chaplaincy and Welfare Department and the Health Services Corps, continues with its hosting of this week's activities to highlight the importance of mental health. A person's mental health is an essential component to their overall health. According to the WHO, there is no health without mental health. Mental health is important, and therefore we see this opportunity to observe this week as something that is critical to each and every soldier's development. Prevention works, treatment is effective, and people can recover from mental disorders and live full and productive lives. Mental health and functioning can be enhanced and the quality of a person's life preserved. Today's mental health seminar focuses on building capacity for the new normal. The COVID-19 pandemic has unleashed changes that have disrupted what we know as normal. It is therefore critical that we understand the pandemic's impact on mental health, financial security, and stress-related anxiety. The purpose of this presentation is to prepare service members to develop a proactive approach to life and family, investing in their mental fitness and optimizing their welfare management so as to adapt to the ever-changing new normal. It is hoped that through this lecture, service members will have a greater appreciation of adjusting to this new normal, which involves learning how to encounter these challenging and changing times. It is our desire that this session will result in building resiliency. Our guest speaker for this morning's presentation is Dr. Calvin Young. Dr. Young is a trained mental health clinician, a veteran of the United States Army, certified in complementary and integrative medicine for mental health. Academically, Dr. Young holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology with a minor in psychology. He is the holder of an earned Master of Science degree in Human Services Administration. And Dr. Young is also the holder of an earned Master of Science degree in counseling. This credential came with an emphasis in addiction assessment and treatment in psychometrics or clinical psychology core. Dr. Young is also the holder of an earned doctorate in psychology from the Atlantic International University. Dr. Young has several decades of experience in the field of applied social and behavioral sciences and is currently in private practice here in Jamaica. His clinical experiences include treating patients in inpatient, residential, hospitals, and outpatient settings on an individual basis, and as a part of a therapeutic treatment team, utilizing group, family, organizational, psychological counseling, and psychotherapeutic techniques and technologies. Periodically, he teaches counseling skills to lay and professional students at the University of the West Indies, and he trains addiction counselors through his Institute for Addiction Treatment, Training, and Research. Let us give a warm welcome on this relatively cold, rainy morning to Dr. Calvin Young.
Good morning, everybody. All right. So I was asked to do a presentation today, and we're going to take about 30 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer, to talk a little bit about something called resilience. You know, as soldiers, you have an interesting job. It is unique, probably among all the occupational specialties that human beings have created and will create, because it is a job that where when you put on the uniform in the morning, it's the only job, to my knowledge, that when you put on the uniform in the morning, you go to work knowing that you could literally be asked to give your life. That is part of the job. Police officers may go to work knowing it's dangerous, but they still expect to go home. No police officer leaves home expecting to be ordered into a situation that could literally result in the loss of his or her life. So it's a very important job that you have as soldiers, as warfighters. Let me say a little bit about me before we kind of get into this, because I think it will kind of lay the ground for what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes or so. I have taught at some of the, or at least one of the universities that's considered to be among the top universities in the world, at Loyola University in Chicago. I have taught at one of the most unique institutions, certainly in its field, Columbia College. Columbia College is the largest arts-based institution, as far as I know, in the world. I taught there. I have taught at, and I'm affiliated with at different times, University of the West Indies, and probably a few other institutions, well, many other institutions as well. But I think of all the presentations I've been asked to do over the years, this is definitely one of the most important honors I think that I have been asked to do in my career this far, and it is to speak to our nation's warfighters. So let me say thank you for your service. It is truly appreciated, and welcome, that you are willing as young people, and not so young people, to make this sacrifice. All right. So let's talk a little bit about building capacity for the new normal. That's a little welcome. So it's welcome in a whole bunch of different languages. You've probably seen this elsewhere. All right. And these are the objectives that we have kind of laid out, and you also have my business card. Before I leave, I will make sure, if we don't already have it, that I leave as much contact information as possible, so that you can always get in touch with me if you need to, either directly or through the chaplaincy and the psychology department here. All right, so we Jamaicans and Caribbean folk and people of African descent are kind of unique, if you think about it, in a lot of different ways. We are here as a result of what some observers, historians, philosophers have referred to as a ma'afa, a great tragedy that is a result of what you see here. The slave trade that brought us into the Americas, and brought our ancestors here. And of course, we are the product of our ancestors, and we stand on their shoulders. It's fascinating. This particular slide is based on some research that was done by, I think, CBS News in the US. My own research indicates, and I've read other historians looking at our history, who have estimated that it is not 10 to 12 million people that were actually brought here, that it's closer to 100 million, and that these are just those who survived. So we are starting off from a place of trauma. There's some interesting research that has been validated recently, showing that historical trauma can be transmitted across generations. So, for instance, what they did in this particular series of studies is they looked at people who were descendants of European Jews who experienced the Holocaust, and they looked at their descendants, and they were able to see how the trauma that those people who experienced that particular human insult, experienced. They could see how that the descendants of these people were experiencing symptomology that were caused by the trauma that had happened to their ancestors. And so we, as an African people, an African-derived people, we have not even addressed the historical trauma that we're all walking around with, that is the cause, to a great extent, of how we treat each other and what we do to one another, the things that we do without thinking, and the things sometimes that we, as soldiers, because as you know, I too was a soldier, just not in the JDF, are called upon sometimes to referee or to address. So resilience is one's ability to positively respond to adversity. It is your ability to respond to the bad things that have happened to you over time or in time. We're going to get more into the psychology, a little bit deeper into the psychology of this as we go along. And then hopefully we're going to talk about some strategies that we can actually use to strengthen resiliency at the individual level, which is, of course, that's where the psychologist's work is done, at the level of the group, and of course at the organizational level, and possibly even at the societal level as well. Because one of the things I've learned in my many years as a clinician is that you cannot effectively treat psychological issues at the individual level without looking at not just family issue level, but also at the community level as well. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how individual soldiers may experience and can respond and build resiliency, and also how squad leaders, unit commanders, it's all the way up the chain of command, can also build resiliency within the operating unit. All right, so, that's resiliency in a nutshell. Resiliency has to do with hope. So, resilience, as we said, it's important for small things, work issues, stress, traffic delays, coming in this morning, Lieutenant Franklin made a lot of calls to my phone. I think Lieutenant Franklin was dealing with some trauma there, as he perhaps thought I was not going to make it. But it was due, of course, to traffic issues. We live here, I assume, and we all, experienced Kingston traffic. And believe it or not, as a soldier, and also because I have a practice, and my practice is island-wide, I have to make sure that I know routes and stuff, no matter where it is that I'm going. I have to have different ways of, navigating when I'm in cities and to get to the cities sometimes, or the towns. But today, I was beaten by traffic, which required, of course, calls upon my use of my own internal resiliency skills to address that particular issue. And of course, there are times, obviously, when you need resiliency and resilience skills to address major issues, such as major illnesses, dealing with abuse, being a victim of violence, or tragedy, or heartbreak. I suppose as human beings, most of us have experienced heartbreak. Some of us will. And I guess if you're lucky, you leave the planet and never have to experience heartbreak. Unlikely, though. If you haven't had it yet or experienced it yet, it's probably going to happen. Okay? You're probably not going to leave here without some heartbreak. All right. So, those with low resilience, people with low resilience, usually even small setbacks will feel like a major disaster. It'll take them a while to get back on their feet. Okay? All right. Those with high resiliency tend to bounce back from setbacks, and then they use that adversity as an opportunity to grow. There's an interesting but incorrect idea that we tend to hear a lot among people who do motivational speaking. And it's this idea that the Chinese word for opportunity is the same one for disaster or something like that. It's actually not true. But it's a good analogy to help us to understand and to accept what we're saying here. That people with high resiliency skills and who develop high resiliency are those who are able to take the adversity that happens to them and grow from it. So resiliency, it lets you stay focused on the goals, on what is most important, and it allows you to always move forward. And that's critical, particularly for us, well, not me so much, but you as warfighters. As nobody cares to some extent, as you know, The mission must be accomplished no matter how you're feeling, or sometimes even if you're injured. And yeah. All right. So remember that resilience is a skill that anyone can learn and develop. Regardless of your age or your stage of life, you can always improve your resilience. All right, not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the different domains of resilience, but research suggests that resilience is it can be put into about 6 different domains. And those are pretty much what they are. If you're taking notes, nobody taking notes? Really? Is that because you're going to get the PowerPoint? All right. All right. So somebody's doing video, so that's good. All right. All right. So well-being is what, while resilience is how. That's the difference between well-being and resilience. All right. So let's talk a little bit about how resilience impacts on warfighters. We talk about the fact, this is some research that, coming from some work that was done by the United States Marine Corps. So this is coming from their resilience training, because they actually have an entire unit. And we'll talk a little bit more about the U.S. military's preparation and attempts to integrate and to increase resiliency among service members. But this is from some data from the United States Marine Corps in terms of what some of the types of stresses that their research suggests that Marines experience. And so they kind of put them into different categories. You got the physical stresses, thinking stresses, emotional stresses, social stresses, and of course spiritual stresses. Spiritual, not necessarily obviously meaning religious. Spirituality has to do with essentially how we see the world and the values that we have. And so those, sometimes spiritual values, as you know, may even conflict with religious values, so that there are people who are pro-choice, for instance, but they're Catholics. We did a series of studies called the Adverse Childhood Studies a few years ago. And what we found is that human beings who experience certain things, such as a family member who's been incarcerated, domestic violence, family separations, all of those factors, all of those things, sexual abuse, substance abuse, as children before they were 18 years old, that all of those traumatic factors impacted upon behavior when they became adults. It had a psychological, a neuropsychological effect on them, on the adult. So for instance, in my clinics, I will tell you this, every single patient that I see in my clinics, I do trauma screening with them. Every single patient. And particularly in Jamaica, what I have found since being back and practicing here is, unfortunately, every single patient that has come to my clinic, for the most part, is in some way, shape, or form impacted by trauma. So we have to do trauma screening on them, okay? So if we understand the neuropsychology of what's happening, we can help the people to build resilience, right? We're going to talk, in the introduction, the chaplain told you a little bit about my background, that I have some credentials in integrative medicine for mental health. That is the real importance of that for our purposes, is the fact that as a psychologist, we can't just do the work in terms of, lay on the couch or sit, and or sit on the chair, most people don't really use a couch anymore. And tell us what's going on, and give you the good psychobabble. Okay, all right. Let me pause for a minute while the video takes place.
Brain development is much more than a story about biology. From the earliest years, relationships with others play a key role in shaping how our brain grows and develops. Early relationships, where there is abuse and neglect, have a long-term impact on children. A brain that has adapted to survive in a threatening or unpredictable world may not work so well in an ordinary environment. This can create what is called latent vulnerability, where early abusive or neglectful experiences with carers put children at greater risk of experiencing mental health problems in the future. For these children, compared to their peers, common experiences like moving to a new school can feel more daunting and stressful. New faces can appear threatening, while positive social cues can be missed. It can be harder to negotiate new social situations and learn to trust new people. Even fun experiences like joining a new sports team can be challenging. Too much focus on potential threat cues can mean missing out on positive social cues such as a playful nudge. Or it causes an overreaction, which leads to an increased risk of conflict and sometimes violence. These reactions can increase the likelihood of generating new stressful events. It's harder to deal with everyday challenges when you feel unconfident and anxious inside, and harder to build and maintain relationships. Over time, this can mean a child loses friends and the support of adults, and so misses out on opportunities to grow and develop. This social thinning can increase the risk of mental health problems in the future. Neuroscience research is beginning to shed new light on how vulnerability unfolds over a child's life. All children need care and stimulation from adults who value them and who show them attention and love. These experiences shape a child's brain development. When children face traumatic experiences like abuse and neglect, their brain adapts to help them cope. We know of changes in 3 different brain systems: the reward, memory, and threat systems. Experiences of domestic violence or physical abuse can lead to hypervigilance, where the brain reacts more to threat. This might help a child stay safe in an early adverse environment, but it can cause problems in more ordinary environments. Hypervigilance can best be understood as a pattern of adaptation rather than a sign of damage. Abuse and neglect can also mean a world where a child's basic needs for care and attention are not met. This can shape the brain's reward system, the part of the brain that helps us learn about positive aspects of our environment and motivates our behaviour. Over time, the brain's reward system can learn to respond differently to things like positive social cues. Neuroscience studies have also pointed to changes in the autobiographical memory system, our memory of everyday past experiences. Following trauma, negative memories appear to become more salient, which means they become more prominent than positive ones, and everyday memories can also become less detailed. This is a problem because we need to draw on past experiences to help us deal with new social situations. Neuroscience research is showing how childhood trauma can create latent vulnerability, increasing the risk of later mental health problems like anxiety and depression. This vulnerability is not just located in the child, but arises through their relationships. Helping children who have experienced trauma still requires ordinary boundaries and consequences, but it also requires us to step back and reflect and see behaviour that we find challenging in a different light. A child may simply be doing their best to survive now, with brain adaptations from the past. We know a child's brain has the capacity to continue to adapt. For this to happen, they need our help to build and maintain trusted relationships, manage everyday stresses, and prevent new ones from happening. We need to encourage them to try again and believe things can be different. This is far from an easy task and takes time. Science is helping reframe our understanding of childhood trauma. Seeing children's behaviour in a new light can mean we respond differently. But there is much still to learn. Working together, we can develop more effective approaches that promote resilience and recovery. We can help children build trusting relationships and create opportunities for their brains to adapt in new ways.
All right, are we on? Are we back? All right, so a little bit more background into what we're talking about in terms of the impact of those adverse childhood experiences, those traumas that we experience as children, and how those impact on us as adults. And so it helps us, I think if we have a broader understanding of this, it helps us in terms of when we deal with the everyday people that we have to deal with, or just when we work, we work with each other, all right? Not going to go too much into the neuropsychology of this, but the brain essentially, or the human brain, is essentially an amalgamation of technically 3 different brains. That's what the current brain has evolved from. So you're looking at the rodent brain, and then you got the lizard brain, and now you have the it's actually true. Mammalian brain. Each one, and it's very actually important because it explains why we do the things that we do, why we respond in the ways that we respond. All right? So a lot of times when we are traumatized, we tend to respond with the reptilian brain. So anyway, all right. So trauma can obviously cause the brain to kind of shut down. So we're going to, all right. So going back a little bit, in order for us to get the brain to where it needs to be, to develop the resiliency skills that we're talking about, you probably need to begin in the beginning. It's fascinating to me how we're training soldiers now. I don't know if any of you have ever looked on how the U.S. military, some of the things that they're doing now in terms of boot camp. When I was a soldier and I got into the military, maybe a decade or so after the U.S. Congress had outlawed physical punishment. So, and it was a different kind of army that I grew up in. And I suspect it's a different type of army that you guys are in, although my interaction with some of the people who train JDF soldiers suggests that we're still doing some of the things that we used to do in the U.S. military about the time when Stanley Kubrick's fascinating movie came out about Vietnam. Anyway, it's another one of those inside jokes. I'm doing a lot of those today. All right, anyway, let's move on. So, resilience is best developed in advance. Many only seek to build resilience after they've experienced a trauma. But if you think about it, at that point, it is much harder to overcome the emotional consequence of the brain insult that has already happened. So what we should be trying to do, we should be striving for, is building up people's psychological inner reserves so that they can use those to better address and deal with trauma. Make sense? All right. let's move past this particular one. It's an interesting one that talks about toxicity in the brain, how different environmental impactors may cause insult to the brain. But if we can't get to it, I suppose that's fine.
I'm Kelly Warner. A recent congressional report that found dangerous levels of arsenic and other heavy metals in baby food is raising concerns for parents. The American Academy of Pediatrics and local doctors say there are things parents can do to help reduce the risk to their babies.
When news recently surfaced that dangerous levels of toxic metals were found in many brands of baby food, pediatricians at Eugene Pediatric Associates fielded questions from worried parents.
I think it's important for parents not to panic based on this new information about food safety. It's better to look at it as, oh, these are some things that I can do to help my baby be healthier.
Metals, including arsenic, lead, cadmium, and mercury, are natural components in the Earth's crust. They're released into the environment as pollution and get into the water and soil used to grow food. The American Academy of Pediatrics says heavy metals found in baby foods are likely a relatively small part of a child's overall heavy metal exposure risk. However, because exposure can be harmful to a developing brain, there are things parents can do. First, switch up your grains.
Try to avoid foods that we know contain more heavy metals, such as rice that has arsenic in it, because the arsenic is in the water where the rice grows.
Instead of rice cereal, try iron-fortified infant cereals made from oats, barley, and multigrains. And serve your baby a variety of foods. Consider making your own baby food to limit exposure from processing and packaging. Breastfeed your baby if possible instead of formula feeding. Arsenic can contaminate well water, and older pipes may contain lead. If you're concerned about that, you can test your water. It's also recommended that you don't smoke or vape. This can expose children to cadmium and lead in secondhand smoke, and heavy metals from the vape coils can get into the air and be inhaled.
If parents are wondering, should I have my baby tested for heavy metals in their body? A pediatrician's answer is going to be no, we don't recommend that routinely unless there's a really bona fide exposure. Lead is an example of something that pediatricians screen for exposure to at times, and we can test for serum lead levels if your baby has a high risk factor for lead exposure. But again, overall, we don't want you to panic based on this information. Just make some really smart choices about how you feed your baby.
If you have questions or concerns about heavy metals exposure in your child, talk with your pediatrician. Learn more at eugenepedes.com/healthykids. I'm Kelly Warner.
I'm sure you guys remember, well, I don't know if you do, but in, I think it was a couple years ago, in Michigan, in the United States, there was, in Flint, Michigan actually, there were some really serious issues in terms of lead being found in the water supply. Some fascinating research was done later on. And what the researchers were able to find is that people who have, and children or adults who have higher, who have higher levels of this particular toxic metal, lead, in their bloodstream have way above average incidence of violence. There's a correlation between that exposure to heavy metals and behavior, particularly the behaviors that we, in many instances, are called upon to address as warfighters, particularly in Jamaica. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted you to see that. And of course, don't worry about the baby thing. Many of us were babies, I assume. Babies become adults. All right. So, of all the people who are impacted, how are we doing on time? Okay. Who are impacted by trauma and traumatic situations, about 10 to 33% of them are probably going to go on to experience diagnosable symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. All right. Let me. See. So let me. I've been told that I need to kind of wrap things up. So let me talk a little bit about managing the stresses and stressors that we, or you, as warfighters, will experience. There are a couple of strategies that the Marines use and suggest to their fighters, their warfighters. And they come essentially under 3 domains that, if you think about it, they kind of incorporate the 6 different elements of resiliency, within resilience, that we had talked about earlier on in the presentation. Strengthening yourself, managing your physical environment, and of course, compartmentalizing stress, the stressors that happen to you. You cannot imagine how many people I see, like I treat police officers sometimes. And one of the things I will notice when they come in and when I bring the family in and they process is that they don't have the ability to put police officer in a compartment, father into another compartment, and husband into another compartment. When they come home, they're still being police at home, which creates all kinds of, obviously, psychological and family-related problems. So that's what we talk when we say, learning how, and it's a skill that you have to, that you learn and that you practice, that will help you to reduce the stresses that your job, because it's, as warfighters, it is a stressful job. As we talked about the fact that it is one of the few, if not the only occupation on the planet where you are literally expected to give and make the ultimate sacrifice as a part of your duties. So that fact makes it a stressful and a stress-inducing job. And so one of the ways we're gonna build resilience is by learning how to compartmentalize those different roles that we have, and that we have to walk through and inhibit throughout our lives. But we talk about strengthening yourself physically, mentally, and of course spiritually. So whatever it is, however it is that you need to relate to the world, to the planet, then you need to focus on those things, take time for those things. Managing your social environment, building trust and support among and with other people, and of course your physical environment as well, addressing how you think, and being what we call cognitively flexible. We tend to see that people who have low resiliency, people who are not able to adapt well, are people who are rigid in their thinking. They lack cognitive flexibility. And part of that reason why I think people don't have this cognitive flexibility, the ability to think in a lot of different ways and to think outside of the box when necessary, is because many of us, unfortunately, we don't read. We don't do as much reading, and we don't read diverse materials. And so that's one of the reasons I think that reasons why we lack that cognitive flexibility. We spend a lot of time on Facebook, in exchanging those pictures and stuff that you probably shouldn't. On Instagram, but not as much getting into reading books and and learning about science and technology and the arts. Okay, so take the time when you get it. If you can go to a play, do things that increase your mental awareness, your mental space, and help you to be able to think outside of the box, because it introduces you to other things. If you get a chance to travel, traveling is one of the great ways to increase mental flexibility, because you're confronted, for the most part, by people who are completely different from you, by cultures who do things that you may do, but they do in a completely different way. And so it increases and enhances your ability to be cognitively flexible. I believe that's my time. All right, so we're going to do some Q&A. All right, thank you. So, ow.
Let me thank Dr. Young for his presentation this morning. Let us put our hands together for Dr. Young.